I want to tell the people how I know you from way back when, which is kind of a cool story. My audience will appreciate this. I wrote a book called The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus.
Yeah.
And I talk about a controversial verse in Matthew chapter 23, verses 2-3. And I won't rehash all of that, but I had a discovery there about a difference of a single letter. And when I went to investigate it, I found out somebody had seen this before me and had observed the same thing and wrote an online article about it. And I decided, even though I discovered it myself, I'm going to give him credit in a footnote because he discovered it first. And that's what you do. That's the mensch thing to do in academia, in scholarship. And so and that's you. I mentioned you in the footnote, having observed that it says, all therefore whatsoever he says to you, that observe and do. And before I published my book, if I remember correctly, I spoke to you on the phone and you told me the story of how you actually engaged with George Howard. George Howard is the scholar who originally published Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew first in 1987, and then again in 1995, the second edition. I've got the paperback or the soft cover here.
Yeah.
So tell us the story about how you had this interaction with George Howard about over this.
That it really was a fun story, and let me publicly say thank you, Nehemia.
Yeah.
That was, for a long time, that was the biggest claim to fame for Ross K. Nichols. I made it in one of your books.
Well, it is still an important claim to fame. Not that you made it in my book, but that you had this really important. You, as far as I know, are the first one to realize the significance. Obviously, Howard saw it before you did because he put it in his book.
Right.
But he didn't translate it.
That's right. That's what I noticed.
So let me rehash for the audience.
Okay.
So in the Greek, it's Jesus says, whatever the Pharisees tell you to do, that observe and do, because they sit in the seat of Moses.
That's right.
And in the Hebrew Matthew, it says he sits in all there for whatever
whatever he will say unto you, do and keep.
There you go. So it's Yomar. That's right. It's been so long since I wrote the book.
Right.
All there whatsoever he bids you observe and do, meaning Moses, that observe and do. They sit in the seat of Moses, therefore whatever Moses tells you to do, that do. And some people have tried to say, oh no, it's the chair that's telling you what to do. Well, chair is feminine, so it would be she.
Right.
In Hebrew, chair is feminine. All right. So tell us about how you observed this before I did, maybe even 10 years, it sounds like, from what we talked about before.
I know that in 1995 is when I first got this copy of the book that you just held up, George Howard's Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. I had heard about it. I was fascinated because at the time I had just begun to study Hebrew, Nehemia, and I thought, I love the Gospel of Matthew. Here we have a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And so I got the book, I began to read, and I was really I was pathetic at reading Hebrew at the time, particularly without nikudot. But I remember when I was reading through, I got to chapter 23, and I see Va'ata kol asher yomar. And I remember looking at that, and I thought, I've just begun to learn Hebrew grammar, and I said, I know in the English translation it says they will say, all that they will say, but that's not what that means. It means he. And all of a sudden, my mind began to think, this is the only way this makes sense, because if you don't see this as he will say, Matthew 23 is sort of an anomaly, because think about it, Matthew 15, Matthew 23, all that Jesus is saying is, look, those scribes and Pharisees don't. And then all of a sudden he goes, whatever they say to you, do and keep. And I'm thinking that doesn't. So I remember I called James Tabor. He told me that there was a conference coming up in several months. This was in 95 when I found it.
Okay.
And so in the fall.
James Tabor is currently a professor, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte.
He's retired.
Emeritus, retired professor. What was he in 95? Was he at Charlotte already?
Not only was he at at Charlotte, but I believe at the time he was the chair of religious studies at UNC Charlotte. He held that position for more than 10 years, I believe.
Okay.
We had become friends for quite some time. And so we went to the conference together, and I remember we were seated in the back. Dr. Howard gave his lecture, and I could not wait. I was a young kid then, and I remember I raised my hand, and Dr. Howard called on me, and I said, Dr. Howard, in your book, the Hebrew says this, but in the English you put they. Now, Nehemia, he puts it in parentheses, if you remember. But
so the parentheses are whenever his English doesn't match what's on the opposite page, which is the Hebrew, he puts the English in parentheses. And his argument was, well, sometimes the Hebrew doesn't make any sense, so I'm just going to translate what makes sense.
That's
right. I guess this didn't make sense to him.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So, but as soon as I said that, he looked at it and he let me continue. And I went on to explain how contextually it made more sense. After the meeting, he came up, we met, and he said, you really need to write this up. He said, can I, 95. I'm willing to help you. And, because we talked, and I said, look, I'm an independent, I'm just, I don't have a degree at school, whatever. So he was very kind and gracious. And I wrote a note to both James and Dr. Howard, and we worked through this. It took a little while. They encouraged me, George Howard encouraged me to submit it to Journal of Biblical Literature. And what was interesting, Nehemia, was I was playing off of, there was an article by Mark Powell in 95 called Do and Keep What Moses Said. So they thought this is perfect. You could kind of piggyback off of that. Long story short, I submitted it to the editor-in-chief at the time, Jewett Bassler. She wrote me back a note and said, your article isn't appropriate for this publication. Okay. And but here's an interesting.
By the way, that's not a bad rejection.
Meaning, it's very nice.
That's what they call a desk rejection. That means they didn't read it. They read the abstract, and more importantly, is they didn't send it to peer review. They just decided, for whatever reason of their own, hey, this isn't something we want. And it very well could be, hey, we already had an article on this. We don't want another article on the same subject. That happens sometimes.
It could be.
I just had a desk rejection like that on an article I sent to a journal, and they said, and in the article I used methodologies. They said, look, you're using X-ray fluorescence. We don't know how to evaluate that. You got to send this to it's an article where there's an interdisciplinary approach. I'm coming as the scholar. We have someone who's a physicist, another person who is a archaeometrist, meaning they use scientific measurements to deal with artifacts. And they said, look, we're a philology journal. We literally don't have a peer reviewer who could even look at this and evaluate it.
Oh, wow.
So it could be something. So that's actually good. If they had sent it to a peer reviewer and they said, hey, this isn't scholarly, well, that's kind of a bad rejection. That happens too, right? That's not a big deal. But
in a way, I was crushed, though. I thought, wow,
you shouldn't be, not for that.
Well, now I feel better about it. It's been a while. I've gotten over it a little bit. But,
okay.
So, but I tell you, what both scholars, James and George, I have a stack of. You remember what a fax machine is, Nehemia?
I do.
This is funny. I'm going to read you one line. Ross.
Wait. This is a fax. Who is this fax to?
It's from George Howard to me.
What? Okay.
He typed a letter. The date.
What's the date?
January 9th, 1997. Now,
wow.
This is ancient. This is like,
all right.
This is like a manuscript that you study almost. George Howard says, Ross, I received your fax. Although a few lines were difficult to read, I got most of it. It's a very good article that should be published as a critical note in some journal. So this is the beginning of it. And then I write him. He tells me, send it to Jewett Bassler. I write both scholars and say it was rejected. Ultimately, he says, look, don't be disappointed. Post it, do whatever you can to get your name attached to this. And that's what I did. I remember at the time I uploaded it on the web, and I sort of had this hope that somebody would find it, and that somebody was the scholar Nehemia Gordon, and then you published your notes. So, but it really is, I think, a significant reading, and I didn't find. George Howard wrote me and he said, you might not know this, but now that you've brought this subject and I started thinking about it, he found in the old Latin that that the reading there is dixerit, I think is the proper pronunciation, which also reflects this he will say as opposed to they will say.
Right. So that, of course, and I actually looked that up last year sometime, or recently relatively, and because now we have really good available, easily available critical editions of the Latin. And there's actually, I think you mentioned 2 manuscripts. There's actually a bunch of them, according to the critical editions, that have dixerit or dixerit. I'm not a Latin expert.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah. So that's interesting. Well, let's save that for a different. Didn't you eventually publish this somewhere other than online
I did. I did. It was on Bible Interp. I believe was
Bible Interpreter.
Yeah, Bible Interpretation or BibleInterp.com, I believe it at the time. So I wanted it out there, and James Tabor recommended this and this academic online publication. So I put it there and I put it on the shelf. And since then, I've been involved in other things, but I do still think that it's a remarkable discovery. And I'm glad you guys, I'm certainly glad it made it in your book.